Thanks a million, everybody. Nice to be up here. I go around the place quite a lot these days giving talks about different counties in the American Civil War, but this is my first opportunity to do one on Galway, which I've been waiting for a long time, because there are literally thousands of Galwegians to be choosing from. We're in a decade of commemorations. People have gone crazy for World War I and 1916 and everything, and in many ways rightly so. There's been an army of books published on, for example, people who served in World War I. There's been quite a few books on Galwegians in World War I. What we do not see is the same happening for the American Civil War. And the American Civil War is almost certainly the conflict that saw more people from what is now the Republic of Ireland fighting in uniform than any other in history, including World War I, as a result primarily of the famine. So what we do in Ireland is we talk a lot about the famine and the fact that so many people had to leave, but we have a terrible tendency of leaving those immigrants at the dockside. We have no interest in what happens to them once they leave the country and go to America, Australia or Britain. And what happens to tens of thousands of the Irish who go to America is that within 10 years either they or their children become involved in this conflict, which costs the lives of 750,000 people. So when you start looking at this kind of history in the round, what they call transnational history, you begin to see the impact of a war like this on places like Galway, which were severely impacted by the famine. And there is no doubt that this is the biggest war in the history of County Galway. So you would think that there should be a lot more research being done on it. I'll give you just a brief overview. I'm not going to go into the causes of the war or anything like that, because that's a lecture in and of itself. What I'm going to do is give you a background of Irish involvement in the war, a very brief overview of how the war, what happened, what took place during it, and then we're going to go straight in, after about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, into Galway people. We look at some of the better known Galway people, who aren't well known in Galway, but, but they're better known in the context of the Civil War. And then we're going to look at what I spend most of my time doing, is looking at the ordinary people, the social history of immigrants, Irish immigrant families who were caught up in the war. And we're going to look at a number of Galway examples of that. And I'll be reading some of their letters, some letters of soldiers who were killed in the war who were from Galway, okay? But first off, a few facts. 1.6 million people who lived in the United States of America at the outbreak of the American Civil War have been born on this island. Right? That's a huge number of people, and it's largely down to the famine. This does not include the huge numbers of Irish Americans, so the children of these immigrants who would have considered themselves just as much Irish as they would have American. So when you start factoring that in, you have well in excess of 2 million members of the Irish community who live in the United States at the outbreak of the American Civil War. If you went to New York in 1861 when the war broke out, 1 in every 4 people you would have met had been born on this island. If you were on Manhattan, that's significantly greater. Anywhere up to 50% of the people there had been born in Ireland. It was the largest Irish city on the planet in 1861. And as a result of that, we can say that in the region of 200,000 people who had been born in Ireland fought in the American Civil War. And again, I'm not including the Irish Americans, the people who have been born in America to Irish parents in this number. This is just purely Irish people, and they are overwhelmingly Irish Catholic immigrants, largely from the counties that were worst affected by the famine. More Irishmen became generals in North and South than any other foreign group. So 18 Irishmen became generals as a result of the American Civil War. 32 Irishmen became what they called brevet generals in the Union Army during the war. You became a brevet general if they wanted you to do a general's job but didn't want you to pay the money. Didn't want to pay the money to you to do it. Or they gave it to you because of your actions on the battlefield. The equivalent in America of the Victoria Cross is the Medal of Honor. At least 146 Irishmen received that during the American Civil War. We'll see a little later on how many we've identified as from Galway, and you will see it as a stark example of the fact that there is not work being done on these people. They're completely forgotten. 1 in 5 Union sailors were Irish born. It's almost certainly the largest Irish participation in any naval war in any conflict. That's well in excess of 20,000 sailors, Irish born sailors, were serving during the American Civil War. And we don't know how many people died who were born in Ireland in the war, but if you look at the average deaths among Confederates and Unions during the conflict, we know that anywhere between 25 and 35,000 Irish-born people, not Irish Americans, Irish-born people died in the conflict. And as I say, it is the largest war in history for many Irish counties, and that is undeniably the case with Galway. So these are people who emigrated from Galway and were killed in the conflict. So, something that's very much worthwhile looking at, I think. So a bit of background then. I said that about 200,000 Irish-born people fought in this war. The story of the Irish in this conflict is one of the Irish fighting for the North, right? 180,000 of the soldiers who fought in the conflict fought in the Union Army, so overwhelmingly for the North. And we'll look at some of the reasons for that in a moment. There were two large formations, what we call brigade-level formations. These are a number of regiments serving together. At their maximum strength, they would have been about 3,000 men. The most famous of them is the Irish Brigade, commanded by men like Thomas Francis Marr, who was an 1848 young Irelander. And then another one, Corcoran's Irish Legion, which was commanded by Michael Corcoran, who was from Ballymote in County Sligo and was a leading Fenian. These are all volunteer units joining up in the war. A number of regiments decided they wanted to be particularly Irish. They're what we would call green flag regiments. The image we see on the right here is a man in the 37th New York Volunteers. So whereas most state volunteer units would carry the American flag and their state flag into battle, these ethnic units carried the American flag and the green flag of Ireland into battle. And there are large numbers from states in New York, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Illinois, you name it, across the north, there are these Irish regiments. But the story of the Irish in the Civil War is one of service in non-Irish units. The vast majority of these guys just joined up in whatever their local unit was, not necessarily an Irish unit, but as a result you find Irishmen spread across every single unit in Northern armies and in Northern ships during the American Civil War. As I say, 20% of the Navy were Irish birth. 12 of those 18 generals I was referring to were generals for the North. Today we kind of classify Boston and Massachusetts as the largest proportion of Irish people, but in 1861 it was far and away New York. New York had the largest number of Irish men in their armies, followed by Pennsylvania, Illinois and Massachusetts. They're the big four, if you like, for Irish service in the Civil War. And although there was fairly good, I suppose, an eagerness among many Irish to enlist at the start of the war, there's parallels with World War I when people realise it's not going to be over at Christmas and that it's going to be a slaughter fest on a huge scale. And from late 1862 onwards, the Irish support for the war in the North begins to drop off fairly dramatically. There's a number of reasons for this. The Irish had been, particularly the Catholic poor Irish, had been fairly badly treated in America in the 1850s, and they saw losses in units like the Irish Brigade during the heavy fight in 1862 as evidence that northern white American-born officers were using Irishmen as cannon fodder. This wasn't in fact true, it's just that the Irish Brigade happened to be in one of the hardest fighting divisions in the army, but there was this perception. The other major event in 1862 is Abraham Lincoln brings out the Emancipation Proclamation. It changes the war from the Irish perspective from one to preserve the Union to one that is to fight slavery. And the Irish of the North do not have much of an interest in the emancipation of the slave. So there begins to be a disillusionment apart from that. It is worth noting at this juncture that there's a lot said about the cause of the war and there's a lot of reasons why people fought north and south, but it is unequivocal. The reason that the American Civil War occurred was because of slavery. What about the Confederates then? About 20,000 Irish serve in Confederate forces, so significantly smaller numbers than in the North. But analysis by Professor David Gleason shows that they actually, as a proportion of the southern population, you were more likely to serve if you were in the south than in the north. There was only one of these full green flag regiments, this is them here, the 10th Tennessee Infantry, who were mainly men from around Nashville in Tennessee. But there were many green flag companies, so groups of about 60 to 100 men who were part of larger regiments who were Irish, and many had very Irish names like the Emmett Guards and so on. 6 Confederate generals were Irish born, and the highest ranking Irishman on either side was a Confederate. How many people here have heard of a guy called Patrick Cleburne? A couple of you. Patrick Cleburne is a legend in America. He has a city of 30,000 people named after him in Texas. He has 2 counties named after him in Arkansas and Alabama. He has statues to him, he has cemeteries named after him, he has numerous biographies. He is a man who spent more years in Ireland than he did in America, and yet he is virtually unknown here. He was killed in 1864 at the Battle of Franklin in Tennessee, but is regarded as the finest fighting Irish general of the war, and is also quite famous now because he wrote a proposal where he suggested that if the South really wanted to win the war, that they needed to free slaves, that they needed to employ slaves in their army and then offer them emancipation as a result. He said that if the South had a choice between being enslaved to the North themselves or freeing the slaves, he felt that they would select that, but they didn't. He was wrong. They did not want to free the slaves. But Claiborne didn't survive the war. Louisiana had the largest Irish contingent because of New Orleans. We'll see now in a second why that was. And analysis suggests that the Irish, while they fought very bravely for the South, if they were captured, they were more than willing to kind of go, okay, well, you know, it was good while it lasted, but I'm happy enough with the new regime under the North. I'm not really that bothered. In a nutshell, this map illustrates why 180,000 Irish people fought for the North and 20,000 for the South. It's a map that shows you the growth of cities in 1860, and it shows all the cities over 35,000 people. And the massive emigrants out of Ireland as a result of the famine were unskilled labourers. And unskilled labourers tend to go to urban centres where they can get unskilled work as labourers, right? And the vast majority of them are in the North. And again, if we look at the South, New Orleans is the biggest city in the States that secede. It has the largest Irish contingent of people who fight for the South. So it's as simple as that. And you can see the huge concentration in the upper East Coast here. Places like Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and so on, New York. So that is, in a nutshell, why the Irish fight in such overwhelming numbers for the North. There's two different reasons why the Irish fight for the Union. One is for the Union and one is for Ireland. The fundamental reason that Irish people fought for the North in the American Civil War from an ideological perspective was to preserve the Union. We find this a hard concept to get our head around today because we don't understand how important the United States was in a global context in the 1860s. The United States was seen as a beacon of republicanism. It was different to the old world in Europe, which was run by monarchs, which was run by a landed gentry elite. The United States, no matter if you were treated badly as an Irish Catholic or not, gave you an opportunity to have a voice, an opportunity to get somewhere. And that meant an awful lot for Irish-born people. And the number one ideological reason why they enlisted, and you see it again and again in their writings, is to preserve the Union. They saw the secession of the southern states from the Union as something that could kill the United States, that it was something that was a major threat. And so they enlist for that. We have the whole range of what we normally find in these types. There's war fever. You hear about war fever in World War I, they talk about war fever in the American Civil War. So adventure. Guys who went to New York, they might have gone there at a young age, they felt a loyalty to their state and they went and fought for their state. Money is a very, very major issue. It becomes even more so in the later war years when there are huge bounties, huge financial incentives to try and get guys to join up. Because surprisingly, when people are finding, God, I could get killed in this war, they're not going to join up. So they give them a lot of money. And people, in fact, leave Galway in 1864 and 1865 with the only intention of going to America to enlist to get money, right? So it's a huge draw for people. Integration is a big one. You know, a lot of these people, a lot of these natives are anti-Catholic. They don't like us. If we fight for them, they will like us. Simple enough. Also, if you look at the propaganda, a lot of the Irish propagandists in the North claimed that the South was an aristocratic society. It was a planter class. You have these planters in their big houses keeping the other normal white people down. They weren't concerned about the slaves. But keeping the other normal white people at a level below them. And they said, where does that remind you of? It reminds you of the landlords back in Ireland. And they used that as an example, okay? So trying to destroy that was one of the aims. But the other was all to do with Ireland, and they're very unique among all ethnic groups who fight in the war. The Germans aren't like this. The Irish fight in the American Civil War for Ireland as well as for the United States. So the United States was the number one enemy of Britain in the 1860s. So if the South was allowed to secede, it weakens Britain's only real enemy in the world. And they don't want that, because Britain is what might secure Irish independence. They see it as somewhere that is a refuge for Irish people. So they're preserving the Union, you're preserving a refuge where families could come. So a lot of these people are writing back, they're sending money back to Ireland for other family members to emigrate. In many cases, fathers, even mothers, are leaving years before the rest of their family can go to America because they have to save to get them across. Preserving the Republic, again, because the Republic offers the best hope for a free Ireland. And for Fenians, particularly to gain military experience. That if we fight in this war, you hear this a lot in 1861, if we fight in this war, we'll then have the experience to go back to Ireland and do it. Of course, they didn't realise that so many of them would then get killed. And it's actually not something that ever materializes. So the Fenians recruit on the battlefield. They do it throughout all the armies of the north throughout the war. So guys are being signed up in the trenches of Petersburg into the Fenian cause, but only a handful of these guys ever make it back to Ireland. And also they argued that the South, which was very closely tied to Britain, although Britain never chose to recognise the South, Britain was reliant on a lot of cotton at the start of the war, and there was a lot of pro-Confederate feeling in Britain at the start of the war. And so the Irish propagandists in the north said, look, the South are with the Brits. They're exactly the same as them. Let's fight the South, and it's just as good as fighting the English, okay? I should stress, though, that the vast majority of people, of that 200,000, I don't think were really interested in what was going on to too much a degree from a political sense. They were starting new lives, but there is a substantial number in the thousands who were viewing this through the lens of a Fenian outlook. So what about the guys who fought for the South then? You have the states' rights, so that's one of the reasons the South chose to secede, that a state has the right to own slaves effectively, decide whether they're slave-owning states or not. And a lot of Irish people felt that states' rights was sacrosanct as well. It was an easy parallel to draw. It's an easier one for us to understand today. This is a little country trying to get away from a large country that's trying to oppress it. And they played this. So John Mitchell, who was a friend of Thomas Francis Meagher, another 1848 young Islander, was a big Confederate supporter, and he made this argument. How can you possibly fight for the North against our new independent country? That's like fighting for Britain against Ireland. Preserve Southern society, because although the majority of Irish didn't own slaves in the South, they had an investment in the economy, because the economy of the South was completely built on slavery. So even if you didn't own slaves, you had an aspiration to own them, or your position in the society was reliant on them. It was their home. So Patrick Claiborne, who I was referring to, was not a slave owner in Arkansas, but he's very clear about why he goes to fight. He says, because Arkansas is my home. These are the people who gave me a future when I had none in Ireland, and so he fights for them. And we have the same economics and adventure package, if you like, that you get with the North. So we're going to take a very, very quick look at how the war developed. You'll hear about this because I know everybody is going to be rushing out of here to do research on the American Civil War afterwards, because it's so important, and it's as important as World War I. But just to give you a flavour, you hear about three main areas of the war: the Eastern Theatre, the Western Theatre, and the Naval War. This is the 11 states that seceded from the Union by the summer of 1861, the spring of 1861. Right, they're the 11 that seceded. Again, they had serious disadvantages. As we saw momentarily, the vast bulk of industrial power was in the north, all the best communications were in the north, the population was in the north, right? So the South had two choices. They could win the war quick, or they could inflict so many casualties on the north that they could force a political solution. The northern plan to win the war follows this, called Scott's Great Snake. And they've developed this at the start of the war, and it is effectively what wins the war. They say, okay, the South doesn't have the material, it doesn't have the industrial power. It relies on exporting cotton, its white gold, to get money, and importing all the stuff it needs to carry on a conflict. And so the North say they'll blockade the ports. And so the snake here is the naval blockade of all the major southern ports. They then want to take the Mississippi River here and split the Confederacy in two, which is something they succeed in the summer of 1863 at Vicksburg. And effectively, that strategy wins them the war, okay? The Eastern Theatre is the one that you hear about a lot. That's where Gettysburg was fought, and Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, and Fredericksburg. This is a map that shows the Gettysburg campaign, and the main reason the war is fought so much around here is because of the distance between the capitals. The capital of the North, Washington, D.C. here, and the Confederacy, which is Richmond in Virginia here. There's 100 miles separate those two capitals. And so the major armies of both the North and the South spend their time between 1861 and 1865 maneuvering between these two cities. A very small area which sees the war concentrated for the main in Northern Virginia. The Western Theatre of the war, which gets much less attention, is where Ulysses S. Grant makes his name. It's where battles such as Shiloh and things were fought. If we're to look, the Eastern Theatre we just saw is this area up here. This is the Western Theatre, where people march back and forth across thousands of miles through the course of the war. And it tends to be one Union victory after another in this area for the entire period of conflict. But before we dive in to looking at some of the Galway people, I want to just make it abundantly clear that the American Civil War was something that affected Ireland. If you were in Galway in the 1860s, you knew the American Civil War was going on. You were reading about it in your papers, if you could read, every day. You were being told about it. I've just done some research on a theatre show that came specifically from America to showcase the American Civil War to the Irish public in the 1860s because they were so deeply interested in it. But Galway and the streets of Galway see a bit of the conflict on their own. James Roach of Galway was the editor of a newspaper called the Galway American in 1862 and 1863, which was published here. He was a nationalist, but it was a strongly pro-union paper, so he was trying to encourage guys to go over and enlist. There's a very interesting case around Loughrea of this. He's a bit of a miscreant. I don't know if there are dodgy people around Loughrea still, but Patrick Finney certainly was one of them in 1860s. Patrick Finney was arrested because he illegally recruited 73 Loughrea and Galwaymen in the 1860s to go to the United States to enlist in the Union Army. So these guys went under false documentation, effectively, to go over and join up in the American Civil War. Now, there was a major diplomatic incident over this. Finney was prosecuted. He got away because it was illegal for British subjects to be enlisted in their own territory by a foreign power. And everybody in Galway was a British subject at that time. So these guys went over to America, and there was a big effort to try and get them out of the army. One of them, in fact, ends up getting killed in the Battle of the Wilderness. But this was something that certainly happened, not in any huge number, but Patrick Finney is probably the most famous case on the island of Ireland. He was operating out of Loughrea. Also, Galway was an emigration port, and so people were leaving here to go to America to enlist. And so when Father John Bannon, who was a Confederate agent, was sent here, there were Confederate and Union agents who would have been operating around Galway during the war. Father John Bannon, who was originally from Roscommon, was sent to Ireland to stop Union recruitment, to try and stop people from emigrating to the north and joining up. And he had 500 posters printed to say why people shouldn't be enlisted in the Northern Army, and they were distributed around Galway so that young fellas who were going over on the boats wouldn't join up with the Union Army. So it's something that was very real on the streets around Galway. We'll hit the leading lights. I'm sure you've all heard of General James Lawlor Kiernan. He's not one of the better known generals, but you have two full generals from Galway who fought, and this is the Union one of them. He was born in Mount Bellew in October 1837 and emigrated to the US in 1854. He was an assistant surgeon in the very famous Irish unit at First Bull Run, the 69th New York State Militia, which was the first major battle of the war, if you like, and the 69th New York State Militia were the Irish unit in that battle. And then he went west to a theatre we didn't look at called the Trans-Mississippi Theatre. Right? And he fought in a battle in Pea Ridge. This is all out Arkansas and that type of way they were fighting. And he was an assistant surgeon out there as well in the 6th Missouri Cavalry. He was badly wounded at Port Gibson. You can see in this image he got his arm bandaged as a result of that. That was in Mississippi. And then he resigned as a surgeon in 1863 and became a brigadier general on the 1st of August 1863. And he commanded an important post called Milliken's Bend on the Mississippi during the Civil War. All right, but he had to resign as a result of poor health on the 3rd of February 1864. One of the advantages of being an officer in the volunteer army is that you could resign. An enlisted man couldn't, like you ran the risk of being shot if you did, but an officer could resign at any point. So he died in 1869 and is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in New York. Okay, you also have one Confederate general, this guy, General Patrick Theodore Moore, born on the 22nd of September 1821. His family emigrated first to Canada in 1835 before they moved on to Richmond in 1850. When the war broke out, he became colonel, so he commanded the 1st Virginia Infantry, and he also fought at that Battle of Bull Run under the command of a famous general, later famous general called James Longstreet. He's one of the most famous Confederate generals. He was so badly wounded there, though, that he couldn't serve actively for the remainder of the war, but he was an aide to another Confederate general called Joe Johnston, and he was put in charge of court martials as well around the Richmond area. He was a provost around Virginia as well. So he was promoted to brigadier general in September of 1864, and at the end of the war he commanded a brigade of local defence troops around Richmond Falls, late in the war. He died in 1883. I should note, as part of a research project I did, I analysed every Irish-born man who served at the rank of colonel and above in the Confederate Army to assess their slave ownership, to see how many of them owned slaves and what type of slaves they owned. He was one of not a very high number of them who did. He owned 5 female slaves. He was a merchant in Richmond, one of whom was a teenager, the eldest of whom was rather unlikely. She was listed as over 100 years old, something like 123 or something, if I remember off the top of my head, which is very unlikely. But he obviously had an investment in the outcome of the war because slaves were a very, very major commodity, and 5 slaves made you rich. There's others, though, at lower levels than generals, and this is one of the most significant. This is a guy called Colonel Patrick Kelly. And Patrick Kelly's main claim to fame is that he commanded the Irish Brigade in the wheat field at Gettysburg. So the book about the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg is called Kelly's Heroes. And he was born in Castle Hackett in Tuam in 1822. Again, another man who served in the 69th New York State Militia at Bull Run. After that, he became a lieutenant colonel in the 88th New York, which was a regiment that was designated the 88th because of the Connacht Rangers, as a direct connection between the Connacht Rangers. And that served in the Irish Brigade through the war. He became a colonel in October 1862 after Antietam, and then, as I say, commanded the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg. He was killed in action, shot through the head outside Petersburg, Virginia in June 1864, and there was in fact a fort named for him, which is currently under threat for redevelopment, but it's called Fort Patrick Kelly, that was named for him during the Civil War. Again, not a very well-known person. I know we have at least one person in the room who knows about this guy anyway. Major Dick Dowling is, I'd say, along with Claiborne, the most famous Confederate Irishman, and he would undoubtedly be the most famous Galway person to fight in the American Civil War. And rightly so. He was an incredibly interesting character, born in Milltown near Tuam. His family emigrated to New Orleans around 1846. He owned a saloon in Houston, Texas. Houston, interestingly, was also the mayor of Houston in later years, was a Limerick Confederate veteran, little known. In any event, he was a saloon owner. He performed one of the most remarkable feats of the American Civil War when the Union decided that they were going to attack Texas. And so they sent a flotilla of, I think, 5,000 men up the Sabine River. And this river was only defended by 47 Irishmen of the Davis Guards, commanded by Dick Dowling. His artillery fire against them was so effective that they had to pull back. He captured large numbers of the Union soldiers, and it was lauded as one of the greatest victories in Confederate history. He was given the thanks of Confederate Congress. Special medals were struck for the men. They were the only medals ever struck by the Confederacy, and he became a real legend. This is a statue to him in Texas. He is, again, one of the heroes of Texas. They hold an annual lecture relating to him every year. Unfortunately, as with many of them, the fact that he survived the war didn't mean that he survived for very much longer. He died in a yellow fever epidemic in 1867. The Medals of Honour, if you recall, I said there were at least 146 Irish-born men who received the Medal of Honour, the equivalent of the Victoria Cross. So little work has been done on them that we don't know where the vast majority of these guys were from. We know absolutely nothing about most of them. So I know that 3 were born in Galway. Now we certainly can say that that is going to be a double figures, but there's nobody doing the work on them, not interested. This is an image of one of them. On the left, that's Thomas Fallon there. He received the Medal of Honour for 2 actions, one when he was in an Irish regiment, the one depicted here when he was in the 35th New Jersey. At Big Shanty, Georgia, he was the first man over the works and he captured a number of officers and men. Another one, Thomas Cosgrove of the 40th Massachusetts Infantry. He captured 7 Confederates at the Battle of Drury's Bluff in Virginia. And then a guy in the Naval Service, Bartlett Laffey of the USS Marmora. And he got it when they put the gun ashore. They put the gun off the boat ashore and it was attacked by a Confederate unit and the guys successfully defended their gun. All right, so they're kind of the equivalent of the VC fellas, but again, huge amounts of work necessary to establish just how many were from Galway. So I'm not really that interested in most of the people we've talked about because they're the more famous of them. I'm way more interested in the little known soldiers and the impact of the war on them and their families and how long that impact lasts. And so I've been trying to devise different ways of looking at that, and one of them is by looking at individual regiments. So I looked at one Irish regiment, the 23rd Illinois Infantry. They were called Mulligan's Irish Brigade. About 1,500 men served in it during the war. And I went through it and I tracked where every one of them was born, where it was listed, right? And so this is the chart, everybody who was born in that unit in Europe. So a lot of them were born in America, but by far in that regiment, most of them were born in Ireland. You'd expect that, a green flag regiment, okay? But then if we look at where they were from in Ireland, this is a map of just the 23rd Illinois, one of a colossal number of units in the Northern Arms during the war. And you will see that there were men from every single one of the 32 counties on the island. But you can see there, which is the darkest, Galway and Kerry are the two highest proportions of people. And what you see time and again, and I see it in the correspondence, is that people don't just emigrate. They emigrate with groups of people. They go out to their neighbours who emigrated 5 years before them, or they go out to the people who they have cousins with who went out 10 years before them. They go to communities, by and large, that are communities derived on where they come from here. So Galway people often find themselves with Galway people over there. You come across it time and again. And what we have here is a unit that seems to have a southwest and western bias, because this map does not correlate with the famine map, if you like. So there's obviously something else going on here where people are choosing to serve together. All right, so it's an interesting demonstration. But that's 71 stories in one regiment of Galway people impacted by the war. Now we're going to start going into detail on individuals. Another way that I look for people is through these ads that are called information wanted ads. We're dealing in a time where most people are illiterate, there are no phones, so how do you communicate with somebody? If you'd arranged to meet someone at the corner of 5th and 9th Street on the 11th of June and they didn't turn up, what did you do? How did you find them? And a lot of people just lose contact for years as a result. What you could do is in one of the Irish papers, so there are Irish papers like the Boston Pilot and the New York Irish American Weekly, where you could run for a charge an ad for a couple of weeks. And they were information wanted of particular individuals. And these are the type of things here. This is one ad that ran in the Boston Pilot on 21st of March 1863. And it's James Riley who's writing the ad. James Riley was a man who married Margaret Thornton in Galway City on the 27th of May 1844, after which they emigrated to the US. He hadn't seen either his wife or his children for a number of years prior to the conflict. Now that doesn't mean he deserted them. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't mean that he had deserted them. Often men went off and worked even in different parts of the US. And we can see from the ad that he hadn't seen them in a long time. He was a butcher by trade and he enlisted at the age of 32 in March 1862. 5'6" in height with brown hair, hazel eyes and a light complexion. And he was stationed in Corinth, Mississippi with the 12th Illinois Infantry when he decided to take out this ad in the Boston Pilot. And for any of you who can't read it, it just says, information wanted of Mrs. Margaret Riley and daughter Bridget of the town of Galway, Ireland, and Mrs. Mary Anderson and husband. When last heard from, December 5th, 1856, so he hasn't seen his family in years, were living on the corner of F and 23rd Streets, Washington, D.C. Any information will be thankfully received by her husband, James Riley, Company K, 12th Illinois, Corinth, Mississippi, which was the front lines. It worked. Often these ads don't work. Often people are dead, right? But in this instance, it worked. I was able to find out what happened to them. 2 months after he put this in the newspaper, he was part, though, of a detachment of the 12th Illinois sent to guard the Tuscumbia Bridge on the Hatchie River. The post was described as swampy and sickly, and after some weeks, he got diarrhea. On the 10th of September, he was granted a 30-day furlough to travel to Washington, D.C., where he was reunited with his family for the first time in all those years. But it was a short-lived reunion because he died on the 2nd of October 1862 in Washington as a result of the disease. But there are others. This is one that hit the papers in America last year in quite dramatic fashion. For example, it was carried in the Washington Post. This is an image that emerged of the housekeeper of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Mary O'Melia, maybe O'Malley. This is her married name. She was born Mary Larkin in 1822, emigrated to Baltimore in 1850, and when the war broke out, she was separated from her children because the lines were between Richmond and her home in Baltimore. And so Verena Davis takes her in as a housekeeper, and she remains the Confederate President's housekeeper for the rest of the war. And after the war, she ran boarding houses in Baltimore, dying in 1907. But that picture emerged to some fanfare in the United States just about 18 months ago. Another man, absolutely unknown. He is the most famous musical creator in 19th century America. A man called Jarlath McNamara is doing an awful lot of work looking into Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore. Born in Dublin in 1829, but he was raised in Ballygar in Galway. Emigrated to the US at 19. He served in a band in the 24th Massachusetts. But this guy played at all the inaugurations. He played at the Republican conventions and Democratic conventions. He was the man in charge of the music when the Statue of Liberty was unveiled. He ran concerts in what's now Madison Square Gardens, a huge number of consecutive nights. He toured Europe, where his band was regarded as the best band in the world. Johann Strauss II composed music for him. He is the modern composer of Johnny, I Hardly Knew You, which is a song that you're probably familiar with. Really an exceptionally famous individual. When he died in Manhattan in 1892, in the region of 500,000 people are supposed to have lined his funeral route. So you can see how significant an individual he is. Another guy, I like this guy, James Gibbons wasn't a terribly well-known figure. James Gibbons was at Fort Sumter. So the American Civil War started at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Effectively what happened there is the South Carolina government, which had seceded from the Union, told the federal troops, get out of the forts. Right, we don't want you in the forts, this is our territory now. Abraham Lincoln had to make a decision whether he would evacuate the forts or resupply them. And he attempted to resupply them. When his resupply ships closed in on Fort Sumter, the Confederates opened fire. And that is the shots that started the American Civil War. Inside Fort Sumter, the American military garrison there had more men born in Ireland than had been born in the United States in it. Right? That gives you an idea. There were more Irishmen in the American army than Americans. And one of them was this guy, James Gibbons, who would later claim to have fired the first shot. And when they'd initially evacuated from one of the land forts into Fort Sumter, his letter home to his wife was repeated in all the newspapers because everybody in America was waiting to see what would happen. And he was saying, we're ready to fight and intend to clean them out. That's what he intended to do with the Confederates. But he afterwards claimed to be the man who fired the very first Union shot at the American Civil War. Whether he did so or not now is another question entirely, but he certainly claimed to, and he gave an account of the firing. His gun was that commanded by Captain Doubleday, and he says, Captain Doubleday, Commanded Company E and was ordered by Major Anderson to fire. Captain Doubleday stood 2 feet behind me as I held the lanyard, and at his command I pulled it. It was a good shot, for it struck the wall at the point, but the next shot from the adjoining gun was a better one. And that's the shot that starts the American Civil War that results in the death of about 750,000 people. So it's a fairly significant part that he played in it. As a matter of interest, 2 men died accidentally, as it happens, but 2 men died in Fort Sumter who were seen as the first 2 men to die in the American Civil War, and both were Irish, had been born in Ireland. So the first men to die in the American Civil War were from Ireland as well. All right, we're going to move on, and we're going to just discuss a type of primary resource that has never been looked at by anyone from Ireland. And I have no doubt that it is the greatest resource anywhere that relates to the Irish immigrant experience in the 19th century. It's a huge treasure trove of information. And they are the widows and dependent parents' pension files of American Civil War soldiers. These are the pension files that people claimed if their child or their husband had died in the war and they were looking for money from the American government. They're precisely the same as things like the War of Independence pension files that some of you may be familiar with from our own wars. You had to supply the same amount of information. So people in them tell you where they lived in Ireland. They tell you why they emigrated. They tell you how big their property was in Ireland. They tell you about their experiences when they go to America. They tell you in what job they worked, how much their children gave them. And in addition to that, many of them include the original letters written by their children or their husbands to them as proof of their relationship. So everything they include in these files is intended to prove to the American administration who these people are. And as a result, they have a wealth of information. We're going to run through a few of them. But I looked to see how many of these people came home. And this is a distribution map of the 219 American pensions that were being claimed in Ireland in 1883. So these are people in places like Galway who were claiming pensions for something that happened in the United States. And here are some of the people who were walking around the streets of Galway who were claiming pensions because people had died. So it shows it's a war that impacts people living here, not just people who'd emigrated. So we have Maria Whelan, who collected her money every month in Clare, Galway, because her husband Patrick had been killed during the 7 days fighting outside Richmond in Virginia in 1862. Bridget Bain, who was in Headford, whose husband Patrick was killed in the 10th Kentucky Infantry. John Coyne, also of Headford, who was claiming a pension because he'd come back from the war. He'd been shot in the right knee and had a disability to his lungs. Joseph Dowd seems to have been in the American Army even before the Civil War started, but was back in Tuam claiming a pension. He probably fought in the Mexican-American War. James Harvey of Kinvara in the 59th New York was shot in the head at the Battle of Deep Bottom, not Bottom as that says, in August 1864 outside Virginia. So these people were part of Irish society but not remembered. Very few came back, but some did. So I was talking about those files. They're all in these stacks in Washington, D.C. in the National Archives. If you handed in a letter that your son had written to you, you never got it back. It was proof. Some of them asked for them back and didn't get them. Many people had to write to priests in Galway at home and say, I need evidence that we were married. And the priest who would charge them for it would write back and say, these two people were married in such and such a location at this date. And that's in the files, okay? So this is what I spend my time going through, is these files. The ones of these we're particularly interested in are the US Army dependents, 1861 to 1910, 1.28 million files. Some of these files are in excess of 100 pages in depth. Tens of thousands of them relate to Irish-born people. So a huge resource. If you want to know about what life was like for people in Ireland of that class during the mid-19th century, it is the only source that you should be looking at, really. But we're not looking at it because we've disconnected from what the impact the American Civil War had on Irish people. So we're going to spend the last while in the talk going through some of these families. And the first one are the Sheppels. Has anybody ever heard of that surname in Galway? Very strange surname. They were Church of Ireland, incredibly poor. All the information I'm telling you now is based on, I've reconstructed it from their file. So I've gone through all their file to try and reconstruct it. We know from their file, because they had to get proof of it, that Maria Galvin and Nicholas Sheppel were married in Ballinasloe, Church of Ireland Church, on the 5th of October 1846. And there was a US consul in Galway, and he would help people in Galway who had connections in America to try and get them what they needed in America. He wrote, William West was his name, the US consul wrote, he said, I have the claims of 3 widows of our dead soldiers, Honora Cleary, Eleanor Hogg and Maria Sheppel, none of whom you will perceive can write, and being also extremely indigent, i.e. poor. In fact, they would be in the poorhouse but for the pay due to their husbands, which I have obtained and paid them. So their husbands in America were due army pay. The US consul in Galway got it for them and gave it to them. All right? And Maria outlines her entire family story. She says she had 6 children. This is their names when they were all born. That her husband was a whip maker. And we know that Nicholas almost certainly went to the United States because of the financial incentive, that he would get a lot of money when he went, because he goes during the war. Because you can see his last child, Elizabeth, is born in 1863. So he's not there before the war. And he enlists in the 6th New York Heavy Artillery, which is this unit portrayed here. He was actually in the regiment when that shot was taken. But his military career was very, very short. He was 35 when he enlisted in February 1864. He was dead from dysentery by June. And way more people die of disease than they do of combat. Maria afterwards moves into Galway with her children, and what becomes of them then we don't know. But the US consul described how she was in great poverty with several young children, and how he had just received a strong appeal from a banker at Galway on her behalf who will come in to see him. One of my personal favourites is the Donohoes from Inisheer, right? So here we have a guy who is a native Irish speaker. But again, we can go back and we can use things like the Griffiths valuation to fill out the story of this family. So we know that Peter Donohoe, who was the head of the family, had a 4 acres, which he rented from the Digbys, that was worth £4 and buildings valued at 15 shillings from the Digbys. So although Peter's name was on the lease, it was his 4 sons who worked the land, because Peter had what was variously described as consumption, asthma, heart disease and dropsy, which is a pretty kind of bad litany of stuff to have if you have all of them. But in any event, he was unable to work the land, so it was his 4 sons, John, Thomas, Peter and Morgan, who did it for them. And we know all this because what they call the widow from the South Island of Arran is writing to the United States to get a pension. And she tells how 3 of the sons had to go to America. They had no choice but to emigrate. But we know that one of them, John, had worked on the farm from the age of 13 and undoubtedly grew up knowing virtually nothing other than Inisheer and the Aran Islands, right? And so he emigrates in 1861 at the age of 18. And he lands and then enlists a couple of months later at the age of 21, so he's lied about his age, in the 1st United States Artillery. And he is killed in action at the Battle of Williamsburg, Virginia, on the 5th of May 1862. So you have this lad who's virtually just been plucked out of the Aran Islands and thrown into Virginia and killed. But as a result of the pension, we actually have details about the family life afterwards. So we know that his father, Peter, dies thereafter. His mother is forced to give up the rent of the land and as a result has no money. So another local farmer rents it off her. And then she gets statements from 3 farmers on the Aran Islands who say this is what happened to her, this is what happened to her husband. She runs into some difficulties because she's supposed to provide a proof from the physician to say that her husband was ill and unable to care for her, but she couldn't do that because the physician on the Aran Islands had died from an overdraft of laudanum. So she had problems there, but she overcame them and eventually got her pension and collected it for the last years of her life on the South Island of Arran. So again, this isn't a story that relates just to the United States. This is one I researched specifically. I have a database that I've now compiled of hundreds of Irishmen from these pension files that I kind of go through fairly consistently because I do it in my spare time. It takes a long time. This is one that I did though specifically this week because I knew he was from Galway from looking at it in the original files, and it's the Finnertys, and they were from Galway City. And again, we have the documentation to show that Bridget Ridge and John Finnerty married in St. Nicholas Parish on the 14th of January 1826. And James, who was the subject of the file, was baptised there on the 2nd of July 1835. And we have this step migration that we see very often. They emigrate first to Birkenhead, to England. And they're living in Birkenhead there in the 1850s when we know that James leaves on his own and goes to America. He writes a letter from Canada West, which is now Ontario, and they include this letter in the file where he says, "I will send you my likeness, my photograph, in my next letter if I can, for I fear that I shall not see you again." And then he says in the same letter, "I'm sorry to see that you're grieving for me." So they're grieving for him because he has emigrated and they're wondering will they ever see him again. They get another letter for him. He goes and works in Chicago. He's working there as a painter in the early 1860s for an Englishman. But then in 1862, he enlists. And the day before he enlists, he writes a letter to his mother saying, "I have left Mr. Rigby," who was the man who ran the painting company, "thinking that I can better myself." Now, he doesn't tell his mother he's enlisting in the army, but that's what he means. He enlisted in the army the very next day in the 72nd Illinois Infantry. He says, "I don't know how things are going on with you in England, but they're pretty hard here." And he says, "I suppose you're living in the old place yet." When people get killed in the war, a lot of times, officers will write a letter saying he died a painless death, it was quick and so on. We know that his mother, Bridget, knew he died a quick death because she included this newspaper cutting with the pension application to prove that her son had died. So this had been sent to her from America to Birkenhead, and then she sent it back for proof. And you'll see there, it says Company B, James Finnerty, and there's an X beside his name to show it. But she knows he died quick, but unfortunately for her, she also knew how he died because at the bottom here, with 2 more X's, it said James Finnerty was literally blown in pieces by a shell. So you can imagine a mother in Liverpool getting that back. She couldn't read, it says it in the file, but it would have been read to her. Letters in this period are generally commonly read in kitchens and things like that. He was killed at Vicksburg in the assault there on the 22nd of May, 1863. Another one here is the Hannons of Portumna. And this is John Hannon, who... People in these files, they don't provide information unless it's absolutely necessary. So the Hannons have a nice big file, there are letters in it, and they never say anywhere in it where they're from in Ireland. Really frustrating for me, because you want to find out where they're from. I think it also actually has an impact on us trying to remember them because people automatically feel a closer connection if you can say, I know there was a lad from Portumna there, but we can't do it. John Hannon, though, when he enlisted in the army, had to give his place of birth, and on that enlistment record he says Portumna, so that's how I know he was from there. So he was born there around 1848, and his family emigrated to Milford, Massachusetts. And if you look at Irish people in Massachusetts in the 1850s and the 1860s, there's almost a nailed-on certainty that there's a good few of them working in the leather trade. That's what they were doing in Massachusetts at the time. Huge numbers of them were working in different aspects of the leather trade. And John, as a young man, lied about his age to get into the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry and go off to war. But he survives the conflict, right? And then he decides he's going to become a regular soldier. He obviously likes it. And he enlists in the 6th United States Cavalry in April 1866. And this is the era that they call Reconstruction, where northern troops, where regular troops are stationed in the former southern states, where they're trying to reconstruct them and bring them back into the Union. And he was posted to Austin, Texas with his men. The documents written by officers talk about it being a hellhole with no trains going anywhere and you couldn't get in and out of it. In any event, on this street, this very street that still survives today, Congress Avenue, he was taking 2 black prisoners towards a watering hole where they were going to get water. And he was on the board sitting on the cart with his gun in between his legs, and it hit a pothole on that road, and the gun discharged and shot him through the head and killed him. Right? But in his file, the last letter he ever wrote home is included, where he says, "Dear Father, my company is going to New Orleans as bodyguard for General Sheridan. It may be possible that we will remain there the remainder of our time. New Orleans is a poor place for a soldier to save his money, but a gay place to enjoy yourself. But nevertheless, I'll send you home all the money I can possibly spare. We've not been paid off yet." Due respects to everybody. His friend, just after this is written, writes home to his sister, and he says, "The affection I have borne your brother John makes me give you the trouble of these few lines, which I hope you will receive as kindly as I intend them. It is but a short time ago that your brother John wrote and posted a letter to his father. In that letter he told him all the particulars as to where he was stationed and how he liked Austin, where his father was to direct his next letter to. But he had no idea it was going to be his last letter to his father's brothers, sisters. But alas, it is, so your brother John is dead." And he goes on to say, "May his soul rest in peace is the wish of his brother soldiers by whom he was beloved and respected. Enclosed you will find a lock of his hair. I thought you would like to have it as a memorial of your devoted brother." The Kellys, again, to return to Ballinasloe, everybody seems to have been legging it out of Ballinasloe at this period. This is a particularly good set of letters. Martin and Mary Kelly married in Ballinasloe on the 29th of November 1840, and they have at least two sons, Patrick and John, who were both born in Ireland. They go to Boston and they work in the leather trade, right? You see it again and again. Patrick enlists on the 16th of November 1861 in a really famous Irish regiment. They would become the 28th Massachusetts Infantry. They would eventually join the Irish Brigade, and he served at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. And his parents included a load of letters written all throughout the war, and it gives a real insight into him and his family and what his interests were and everything. So one of the letters he writes at the start of the war, "We're in good health and have an appetite that would eat a horse," he says. Everybody talks about how they're doing so well when they first join up. And he says, "Tell Larry O'Gaff I will shoot Jeff Davis on a sour apple tree." That's a reference to a song about Jeff Davis being shot on a sour apple tree, the president of the Confederacy, right? He goes on then, he has later letters where his parents are obviously saying, "We're going to come out and visit you." And he says, "You need not be in a worry about coming out to see me. I'll be back in Boston after the war with the help of God. So you need not be foolish spending money. The next time you write, let me know if you receive any money from the state." That was state aid. "I don't need much at present, but you can send that box if you want to. It's a box of goodies. And I should like that you would send a guitar and some songbooks if you can. I tell you what it is, a fine thing to be a faw." That's Fágha Balla. It's the motto of the 28th Massachusetts, which is also a motto for a number of Irish units in the British military. He references a song then, that is a song about the 28th Massachusetts that had just been composed and that is still today being recorded. You can find it on YouTube. He keeps writing throughout the war. He survives Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, so really, really hard battles. He says, "I received your letter, which gave me great pleasure to hear from you. I got your likeness," so they sent their photo, "the same day I got the letter, and I got the other things you sent." He goes on to give a rather unlikely story that he couldn't send the money back because he put the money in a tin box in his pocket and climbed the mast of the ship, and then when he got down it disappeared. I'd say he probably went out into town. But however, he writes again, "They've just joined the Irish Brigade. For any of you who've ever heard of the Irish Brigade in the American Civil War, one battle is more famous than any other. It's the Battle of Fredericksburg." And he writes just before that battle, he says, "We now lay opposite Fredericksburg. The rebels hold the city and we are on the other side. We don't know the minute we will be called on to cross the river or start off somewhere else. We joined the Irish Brigade about 1 week ago. The brigade gets as much beef as the whole corps. Fágha Balla is the war cry and no turn back. Of course we will cross the river first, but no matter. Trust to Ireland's bold brigade to clear the way." And he goes on about how he's lost his copy of Longfellow's books in a knapsack because it was stolen when they had to leave it behind. And he asks for his father to send the lyrics of a song called Mary L'Amour, which is a lament that you can still find the lyrics to. It's still sung. He survived that engagement, but was killed on picket duty at Kelly's Ford on the 3rd of December 1863. Another man who didn't come back. These are a drop in the ocean. These are just some of the other people from Galway who I've come across in the files, and this is a very small number. I only put them in because I can name the villages they come from. So the mother of John Brown at 100 New York claimed a pension in Galway. She was still in Galway because her son died of disease. Michael Kenny of the 42nd New York's mother was in Galway claiming a pension for her son who died in Andersonville, Georgia. Thomas Ward at 175th New York, his mother was claiming a pension in Prospect Hill because of his death. John Healy at the 10th Illinois Cavalry, his family were married in Menloch, Peter Malloy, 55th Pennsylvania. His family were married in Clonbur. Patrick Horan from Killimer, and Thomas Rooney, probably Roney, from Ballymacward. And that's just a handful that I've come across. So it's a very, very widespread story. The pension files I go through are all for Union soldiers because, of course, the guys who fought for the South were rebels, so they weren't entitled to a federal pension. They became entitled to a federal pension in the 1950s. Okay, so if you were still around or had dependents, you could get them from then. But some of the Confederate states, the former Confederate states, gave out pensions to guys who could prove that they were really poor or indigent. One of them is B.T. Johnston, who, although he served in a Georgia unit, that's a Georgia unit on the left, received a pension in Texas, right? And he was barely literate, but he's writing in 1917 about getting his pension, and he was arrested for peddling images of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals in New Orleans in 1916. So he was obviously a hardened Confederate. These guys didn't just disappear at the end. Again, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Galway men who go into the homes that are established for volunteer soldiers. This is just one example of them. We have the entry on the left here of John Kelly, born in Galway in 1836, serving the 5th New York, and he was shot in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. These can often tell very sad stories. I came across one of them where they ask you for your next of kin, and the guy wrote, "I haven't a friend in the whole wide world," is what he told him to put down. But this man, John Kelly, has no next of kin, so he probably is alone in America. He enters the National Home on the 14th of September 1896 in Dayton, Ohio, and he dies there in 1901. And there's an account of his effects down here, his back pay that's due, and it says that they sold his personal effects for $1.25. I often say, well, why don't we remember the American Civil War? And people go, oh, it's a long time ago, you know, it's 150 years ago. Why don't we remember it? There are people in this room who were alive when the last Irish-American Civil War veteran was alive. The last American Civil War veteran from this island that I have found died in 1950. He was a Confederate serviceman from Limerick. So when you put it into that type of context, we really have very little excuse for not doing a bit more about these people. This is the longest living Galway veteran I found. He was a man called Edward Foy, who's supposed to have served in the 9th Pennsylvania Infantry. He was an interesting guy. He was a Mason. He comes up in the papers quite a bit. That's not him, by the way. That's just a photo of a standard veteran in the 1950s with his great-grandson. Emigrated to the US in 1861, lived in Iowa and Portland, Oregon. The Masons in his local area claimed him to be the oldest Mason alive in the United States, and he died in a veterans home in Oregon in 1939. So, I mean, this is giving you a concept of how close this conflict is to us. You often hear that it was the Irish service in the American Civil War that integrated the Irish into the conflict, and that's not really the case. What integrated the Irish in is how they remembered it. The Irish in America, over the 50 years after the conflict, took every opportunity to say, we fought in that war. We were part of the preservation of the Union. So the later floods of immigrants like the Italians and things couldn't claim that. The Irish could, along with the Germans, and they really, really employed that over the next 50 years. And again, the distant past, that's Jeremiah O'Brien from Limerick. I'm from Limerick, you can tell he's from Limerick, can't you? The good looks. He doesn't look Irish at all. Anyway, that's a photo of him. He died in Texas in 1950, as I say. But these two men here are both living in Ireland, and both their grandfathers fought in the American Civil War. This man down here owns a pub called the Cotton Ball in Mayfield in Cork, called the Cotton Ball because his grandfather made a load of money in cotton and bought half of Mayfield. And they now have craft beer that you can buy that has pictures of their grandfather. And this man who is holding the journal written by his grandfather, he's himself a Congo veteran, a journal written by his grandfather that details his experiences during the American Civil War and afterwards. Thomas Byrne was his name, that's his photo in the background. So very, very close to us. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.